Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 7th and final session of this year's conference. I'm Steve Holton, the Electrical Services Manager at Oxford Brookes University. I'd like to introduce Nigel Peet. Nigel will be discussing living and working in a low-carbon estate, a building project sponsor's view of defining, building and moving into a green building. Nigel is an independent consultant who has worked in the areas of ICT strategy, green ICT, carbon reduction, along with building design and refurbishment projects. He has 35 years' experience across the education sector, spent mostly in higher and further education. Nigel is the author of a number of regional strategies in ICT and is the recipient of a Design and Innovation Award for his last major educational new build. Nigel.
Thank you. Hello. I feel as if I should collect in your... is this on? Is this working okay? I feel as if I should collect in your grids before I start talking. It seems to be a convention here that we ask questions before we start speaking. How many people have got a DAB radio? How many people listen to more stations than Radio 4 Extra? Okay, me too. Nothing really to do with what I'm talking about, but it was a question to ask. I don't see why I should talk about my own green credentials, but since I enjoy my cars, I may as well. The two slides up there are two cars of mine. They're both 1999 Honda Insight Mark I. The one on the left, best mileage 117 to the gallon. That's not bad. So I was commuting 118 miles a day, so I thought a gallon a day, not too bad. So what I'm saying is that I don't just tell other people to do it, I do it myself. I'm going to be drawing very heavily on the last major project I was involved in, which was about 5 years of rebuilding that space that you see there, and the view from the front, 1960s concrete structure, going very rusty at the corners, an awful lot of HAC in it. So it was literally falling down, although it doesn't look too bad there. At the start of the project, I was writing a lot of strategies I wasn't very closely involved with, too much of the detail, but I was very interested in what people were expecting out of the new campus. It was a £75 million budget. What did they want out of it? So you've seen these Wordle things, haven't you? You put the text in that people write about, and it comes up with a series of words that the typeface size indicates how important or how often it appears in the text. So over on the left, eco-friendly, future-proof, inspirational, all very key words for people. It's surprising how quickly they forgot that. But I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that later. So this morning, as you've heard, I want to talk about designing and building, moving in, living in a green building, and also touch on some research that's going on that will be the subject of a peer-reviewed paper, I'm hoping later in the year. So going back 5 years, or 6 now actually, the brief to the design team, that's the architects, the engineers, the structural people. To give them an idea of what was wanted, we presented somewhere in the region of 25 slides. All I could find on sustainability in there was the following rather vague statement. In other words, the senior management team of the organisation knew what it wanted, sort of. Didn't know any of the detail. But then why should we? And what the architects have come up with in response to that is a modern building, lots of glass, where out of the back, and this is one of the early sketches, out of the back come all the different areas, different facilities, big sports hall sticking out at the top left, classrooms down at the bottom, learning resources, library in the circular building. But my interest this morning is the pace of change and the rate at which engineering in the building has outpaced the people who occupy the building and their ability to adapt. This is purely from observation and having to live and work with those people. We all adapt at different rates. I bet there's quite a variety of your locations on the graph that you've just produced. Some of you will be working at one pace, some of you will be working at another. And the rate at which we can change and adapt to our environment is also highly variable. Some of the people I worked with were very keen to try out new ideas. Some of the people I worked with were very keen to say, well, hang on a minute, what's wrong with what we've got? So let's, just to illustrate that, you remember typewriters? What happens when we move from one technology to another? People find it very difficult to adapt very quickly to new technologies, and in fact, if you're not thinking about things like this, you revert to previous successful behaviours, in this case quite a costly one. Which leads us to two distinct kinds of problem in this area for those of us that were having to manage the project through. There are hard problems, not difficult, hard in the sense that they have a very edgy solution. They tend to be process oriented. You go through a particular process, you come out at the other end, and we've got, because we've done all the calculations, we know the volumes, we know the occupancy, we know the kind of activities, therefore this is the HVAC that you need. Very simple. The things that were most difficult in this particular, in any project like this I would suggest, but this one in particular, were the soft people-oriented planning, looking at how we actually change people's behaviour in order to live in a completely different kind of environment. Referred to, like all town planning, people planning, social problems, as wicked problems. Now, a guy called Roberts in 2000 indicated 3 different ways of operating within the context of wicked problems. And I have to say that that project teams generally, and certainly mine in particular, used all 3 at different stages of the project. Early on, quite authoritative. It was given to just a small team of people to say, well, this is broadly the sort of area we want to be in. It's going to be very sustainable. It's going to be like this. It's going to introduce new kinds of technologies and teaching techniques to people. It's going to bring the organisation into the 21st century. Then bringing in other members of the team, a competitive approach, where, because these people weren't involved early on, being authoritative, start to disagree and argue and present a different point of view in trying to reach some kind of accommodation and decide where the money was going to be spent, until finally collaborative working, trying to engage more stakeholders and trying to come up with some kind of agreed common response. This third one takes a lot longer, so I can understand why people might be more interested in staying in this domain. I would suggest that working through those is really very important. Collaborative working at least is one attempt to try to engage with all the stakeholders and try to move people on. Let's have a look at collaborative working. The areas that we could be collaborative in were, well, just generally what sort of things are going to involve and engage people in their daily work. Some examples: how do you get there and how do you park when you get there? What sort of communication systems are going to be across the building? How's the digital signage going to work? Who's going to look after well-being? How's the catering going to operate? What are we going to do about libraries, and how are we going to do about eating? Where are we going to eat? It's all that sort of thing. Was an attempt to engage people, and an attempt, we realised later on, to change behaviour. We had everything there except the really most important one, the one we missed. And I think with hindsight I can understand why. Everything but using a green building. Everything but the thing that was going to impact probably most on people's day-to-day work and people's comfort and well-being. However, these groups were encouraged to read extracts from Thaler and Sunstein's Nudge. Have you come across that little red book? Anyone read it? Okay. It's a great little book because it talks about how very, very small detailed changes can lead to very large changes in behaviour across populations. One of my favourites in the book is about Schiphol Airport. You may have heard this one in a different context. Schiphol Airport, the estates people there were concerned about how much it was costing to clean the toilets. They must have been analytical. But the cleaners actually said, well, it's actually the men's toilets that really take the longest. The women's are okay, they're nice and clean. The men are really messy. Excuse me if this starts to get a bit uncomfortable for anyone, but it would appear that they said that when the men stand at the urinals, they're just not very good shots. So, what do you do about that? Well, I suppose you could put lots of signs up asking people to aim properly and so on. But what they did, the team at Schiphol did, was to have made and produced about 1,000 little tiny ceramic flies, which they stuck into the urinal close to the outlet, the waste outlet. And the cleaners came back later and said, problem solved, because everybody tries to aim at the fly. That's the kind of thing we were interested in. We were interested in, at least in those areas that we were collaborating over, we were interested in those kind of wacky things that, slightly off the wall, tiny, cheap things that would change people's behaviour. Another example of that comes from a VW-sponsored project called the Fun Theory. Again, if you've come across this before, my apologies, but it is fun. you go to thefuntheory.com, you'll see a few more of those. There's the endless litter bin, the talking litter bin, a whole load of things there that really were intended to spark off ideas about how we change people's behaviour, because that, for me, became the obsession throughout the latter stages of the project. By which time it turns out it was probably too late, but nevertheless it remains an obsession. Let's just remind ourselves that what we're asking people to move from is a 50s, 60s building which was upgraded because the front and rear facades of the tower were getting very, very old. They had crit-old metal windows, single glazed. And the board at the time, I didn't join them until much later than that, but the board at the time thought that it would look much nicer with double glazing. So that's what they did. And the site couldn't cope with increased levels of rainfall. In fact, the local authority in the area increased the flood risk of the immediate surroundings of the campus to a red risk, which means the potential for up to 2 metres of flood water. It was all coming off of that site. Highways were constantly on to me at one time, but what are we going to do about it? It was also designed to run more or less at the temperature that the building managers set on the boiler. There was nothing more than that in the building. Of course, what they didn't realise when they put in the nice double glazing, that the solar gain in there was phenomenal. So in fact the temperatures in those rooms, without any change to ventilation, increased by anything up to 15 degrees in the early summer compared with previous years. So again, what seemed like a nice idea at the time turned out not to be, and it was another reason why the whole thing had to be demolished in the end. But like colleagues at Bradford who talked yesterday about the fact that they started early, at least some of the changes were started early in this project. So people were encouraged. You can see there are actually empty shelves there. A few weeks before they were full of papers. The end of every corridor had a waste paper recycling bin, and it was a very large bin. I was amazed that every week they could be wheeled out full. I don't know where the paper came from. But one of the things that I really forgot about was that in spite of all this, people were clearing out of something they thought was home. And that was a significant reminder to me now that the emotion of moving out of a building like that should never be underestimated. I actually came across 2 or 3 people in tears when they were moving out of the building for the last time. They'd worked there for 20 years. Now, for me, who'd just turned up, Johnny come lately, building a new place, I was kind of responsible for their upset. I don't know whether any other project sponsors have ever come across that, but I was felt to be responsible for all of the emotion. However, I was far too keen to get on and build this new building, which was naturally ventilated, or at least mixed mode ventilated, chilled water, air source heating, underfloor heating, gas backup only boilers. The rooms had temperature and CO2 sensors, so when you've been in there for an hour, the upper windows automatically open, and the room is slightly pressurised to vent the CO2. Stops you falling asleep, apparently. Heat recovery, all of the things you see on there, everything that the designers and design engineers could possibly think of. And here's the crunch, designed to operate on that range of temperatures. Now, all of the preparation that we did and everything that we tried to do never actually took account of that, and that was the key, as far as I was concerned. With hindsight, the post-occupancy review was that really we should have focused a little bit more on that. Simply because we've got used very quickly to insulating ourselves from the outside world in our buildings, and I think I'd suggest that's actually quite a recent phenomenon. And that was the hardest thing to adapt to. But in the spirit of Nudge and the Schiphol Airport project, although it cost maybe a little bit less, we produced a whole load of cheap LCD thermometers, because one of the things that because the temperature was in a range like that, there were people always complaining, it's too cold, it's too hot, it's I'm uncomfortable. In fact, we had one area where we moved a number of people into a very, very large space. Previously they'd been in small cupboards, little offices where they could have their fan heater, they could have their fans or the windows open or whatever. Suddenly they're in a very large office that was only mechanically ventilated. And two people sitting opposite each other within 2 meters. One was wearing a very thick jumper, another one was in a t-shirt, and that was their response to it because that was the way they felt. So we thought if we put thermometers out there with instructions, and it's hard to read there, but it says temperatures will vary throughout the day. Please only contact estates if it falls below 17 or goes above 27, because people were contacting at 20 degrees saying it's too cold, or 24 saying it's too hot. It's a very, very difficult thing to adapt to because it's such a subjective area as to how warm and cold you feel. It depends on where you've just come from, what you're used to at home, your state of health. All of those things all contribute to the response to the range of temperatures. So we're in a situation where perhaps we might have to do something like this. One of the suggestions was, well, why don't we have a dress code that actually tells people, not like this one incidentally, this is from a royal palace in Bangkok. I just happened to find the picture last night and I thought it might be appropriate. But something like that, because when people actually say, I'm feeling really cold, they're usually sitting there in a short sleeve shirt. It is summer, but they've moved to the cold side of the building, and the heat recovery hasn't circulated the heat at that point. So maybe you need to wear a jumper. And of course later on you take it off. And in terms of dressing appropriately, these are German people who, it's in The Guardian, March 2011, who like to go out and actually feel the cold. And I use this as an example sometimes to say to people, well, not everybody feels the cold in the same way that you do. Not everybody needs to dress appropriately. However, where projects go well, in my experience, and a function of the government's push to achieve its carbon reduction targets, is that a greater proportion of the overall project budget now is available for us to spend on M&E, and in particular on green technologies. So we have the opportunity to subscribe to the United Nations Commission on Climate Change, do something positive for future generations. The engineering response to that, of course, is that a lot of routine tasks can be automated. So keep people away from the systems and they'll look after themselves. But actually, one of the things that we find is that when people feel that they don't have a control over their environment, whether that's real or virtual, then it introduces a great deal of stress into the work environment, and we get a lot of complaints. I'll bring some examples of that up in a moment. It goes well where visionaries get the building they deserve. It's one thing being authoritative, but you've got to get it right. If you're going to be visionary about this, then you need to be sure that your vision is shared. Most of the people that walk into the building that I showed you are somewhat awestruck by what they walk into, because it's a very, very high atrium, it's very light, beautiful, bringing the outside world into the inside atrium, and everyone wows at that. When they've been there a few days and they've experienced some of the variations in climate, then they're not so impressed. And this is where I think it goes wrong. We've already seen the rather vague client design specification. I think what that leads to is sometimes if you have very, very enthusiastic young design engineers, which we had on this project, they want to throw everything at the building that they can think of. And they justify that by saying, well, this is what you asked for. It also goes wrong where there is this, as I've already mentioned, this loss of environmental control on the part of the building occupants. And building systems. Now, yesterday, I think, was it Arup? I was looking at the Arup thinking, I would have committed crimes to get my hands on that software when I was involved in this project. Because one of the things that went wrong quite often was really caused by a lack of integration and operational feedback. In other words, when one part of the team makes a change, it's not necessarily reflected through the other systems, and of course you then get into this game of it's always the other system's fault. I'll illustrate that in a moment. Too much culture change. I'm not sure how much is enough, but again, taking people out of their little cupboards, out of their areas where they can have small electrical appliances, is a huge culture shock. Too much of that in one go? I don't know. Is there a Chinese saying that says if you want to poach a frog, drop it into boiling water and it'll jump out? Put it into water and heat it up slowly, you have poached frog. Is it better to drop people in at the deep end and let them get on with it, or is it better to bring them up slowly through drip feeding information about how this is going to be? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I'm hoping the research I'm involved in will probably answer some of those questions. But certainly one of the things that was at fault in this project was the amount of training that took place. So going back to the approaches to wicked problems, the collaboration was part of that training. But the real training, which was how the systems operate and what it's like to exist with them, didn't happen. The second point there is an interesting one, because we hadn't actually taken account of what a culture shock it would be. Then we started to get complaints, and when the complaints don't appear to actually bear out any result, or indeed any change. So in other words, the heating isn't turned up just because you complain that it's cold at 24 degrees, you want it 28. You have to wait until the sun comes over and starts to heat the building. We started to get complaints about health and safety, so we get those tensions between green living and health and safety. Is there a real tension? I don't know. But nevertheless, it's one that's introduced. This became my bugbear, was the commissioning phase. Just to summarise that, because there's a little bit of information that needs to be brought together. I've talked about the naive client. The design engineer wants to do everything new, and the builder fails to integrate systems. Now, these are all things that happen in not just in the project that I was involved in, but in a lot of other projects that I visited. People start to perceive flights of fancy. Whose idea was this? Whose idea was that? I'll give you an example. So on the left, two light switches. One is actually to do with was actually a dimmer, and the other one was an on-off switch. The first thing that people discovered was that it's counterintuitive. I don't know how many of you put the light down to switch it off, but that's what happens with these. The design engineer's response to that was, well, the lighting's going down, so we thought down would be intuitive. But in fact, because it's different from what you're used to at home, then people got rather angry about it. Also, it wasn't actually a switch. It was something that I'm sure you're familiar with. It sends a signal up to a Data network, and that signal then causes the computer in the system to dim the lights, turn it off, turn it on, or whatever. But because no one actually knew that, they were pushing things, they were overloading the signals, they were sending on-off signals, and the whole thing was getting very confused. The one on the right is an override to the Windows, and this was actually one of the things that did work and gave people the feeling that they had some control over what was going on. If the Windows opened at one particular point and they felt that it was a bit drafty, they could actually operate that switch and close them down again, which would isolate the system from any further automatic response for 20 minutes. Just an anecdote about the switches, and the lack of integration between the different parts of the design project. The architects thought that the project team wanted the switches to be out of the way so that students and other occupants couldn't fiddle about with them, but they were there if they were needed. The M&E engineers didn't put any presence detection in the room, so you had to switch the lights on. But where were the switches? Originally they were behind the door, so I had to spend 3 weeks at Easter altering manually a whole load of drawings and signing saying that actually we want the switches in the room where they can be got at. And again, the ARP software, I suggest, would have presented that, and that's why I would have killed for it. Going back to commissioning became a real bugbear. Simple question, should it be about users as well as systems? Because in the commissioning, where the commissioning engineer goes around with a checklist and says, yes, this works, and that works, that's fine, tick. How do the people feel about it? No one really knows. I'm suggesting perhaps that commissioning ought to be a two-stage process. There's the hard part, as in the systems part, where you tick the boxes and you say, okay, this works, that's got power, this comes up to temperature, that gives a particular flow rate, that's okay. Later on, once the building's been occupied, it'd be a good idea to come back and say, is that flow rate appropriate? The middle point there, the sample frequency as well as we're walking about. Again, I don't know what's common in projects that you operate with or you've run, but we were looking at 10% sampling. Now, some people tell me that's a little bit high, but since that was it was a new building, we had to get it right. I was suggesting that it should have been higher than that. And just to illustrate the point, walking around, checking out automatic opening windows and override switches. We walked past one room and I said, well, just humour me, come in here, test this one as well as all the others that you're down to test. And sure enough, it didn't work. And a little wire had not been wired in correctly, pure accident. How do things like that get found out? I suggest it should be commissioning, and I'd rather see a much increased frequency. Is it unrealistic to expect that the building works on day one? Because again, if it fails to operate in the way that people expect, then I'd suggest you're going to fail. So if it was possible that we have a building, there we go, we've got all those nice things in it, we've got all the interesting systems, it's a green building, everything functions, the systems function as they should, then we could concentrate on the last barrier to a fully functional green estate, that's the occupants. I was interested in Bradford's percentage, 33% improvement in energy consumption simply by concentrating on occupant behaviour. That is, of course, as long as you can get to grips with the O&M manuals. This is not an exaggeration. If you've ever taken over the O&M manuals of a large project, that's what it looks like. And again, I think something like the ARP software, I have no connection with it, I've not even spoken to the guy, but would probably do away with this because one of those shelves was just the index. There are some concerns. This is sort of a side issue really, away from occupant behaviour and living in the building, but I have to say that, that talking to the engineers post-occupancy about concerns about climate change, which depending on who you listen to is either going to be serious over the next 30 years or the next 70 or 80 years, but the fact is it's going to get serious, and it's certainly going to get serious within the lifetime of that building. If we look at an average annual temperature increase of 3 degrees, how are the systems going to cope with that? Is there enough flexibility? Is there enough latitude in the design to cope with that? And at that point, the design engineers grumbled and looked at their shoes, because I suppose the answer is we don't really know. Although I see the new man at DEFRA, according to him, it's not going to happen anyway, so maybe it's not such a problem. Moving on to the research, the British Psychological Society again did some research which has been published in the citation at the bottom, The Psychology of Sustainability in the Workplace. And this is where I'm interested in what in fact are people doing to try to raise awareness and try to encourage green behaviours and try to encourage people to understand what it's like to live in a building where you experience almost all 4 seasons in the space of a day. And they're suggesting that the kind of campaigns that Bradford were talking about were most successful, they felt, as the recipients of those campaigns. The least successful were ones where people get punished. And I have to say, in my own project, someone did suggest that we started to look at people's budgets if they behaved in an ungreen fashion. It looks as if that's not going to be successful according to this research. Something that was carried out by a colleague at UCL was in the new visa building as it moved down into central London. The light, dark, well actually no, on that screen it's darker, isn't it? The darker area around here, this line here is the pre-occupancy response to these different environmental impact areas. You can see those external noise, people noise and so on. The lighter, the orange or brown as it looks on their line, is the response post-occupancy. So in other words, the new building seems to have improved everything except privacy. And again, that's not uncommon, because what we tend to do is to go for large open spaces and keep people out of enclosed offices. Certainly the visa building has got bookable meeting rooms, but it would appear that people don't like using them. But in everything else, post-occupancy, the engineers seem to have got it right. They're happy with the ventilation, happy with indoor quality, indoor air quality, and so on. So there is some work being done, but again, I guess this is another little promotion of the iServe project. The more data we can accumulate about how these things operate and people's response to them, then the better equipped we might be to better equip occupants to move into those buildings. So from my own work that's involved visits to a number of green new projects around the country, very little occupant training actually takes place. There's involvement, there's the questions of what you want, there are the issues about, yes, well, let's sort out the transport, let's have more places to park, which incidentally is often turned down by the planners. But where there is training, it's after people have occupied the building and after they've actually got really cross about the light switches or the windows. Certainly most people will say, well, it took 18 months to get the BMS working. But actually that's not the same as a bedding in period for the building, for the occupants. It could be what I call 2 occupant generations. In other words, the staff has to turn over sufficiently at the level of influencers for the building behaviour to become normal as far as people are concerned. Otherwise you've always got people saying, oh, it was much better when we could do this, it was much better when we could do that. And strangely enough so it does take rather a long time, and the indications are that it could be a very long time indeed unless we can identify where this sort of where this information lag is coming from and do something about it. Performance slippage as well is something that was very noticeable on that project. In other words, this is what you designers told us it was going to be like, this is what it's actually like. So where does that disparity come from? Again, the Going Green research indicates that users, and there are several reasons they put forward for this, do things like leave windows open where they've got the ability to open windows, leave lights on where they have the ability to leave lights on, leave their IT switched on all the time, simply because when they want to come back and check an email at 3 o'clock they don't want to wait 5 minutes for it to start up. Where they complain about environmental concerns, about temperature, so the estates people, just for an easy life, actually start to crank things up and alter parameters. Where users of the building don't zone correctly, so you find that in an educational institution someone is actually teaching a class up on the 4th floor, so the whole floor is lit and ventilated and heated, where they could be working on the ground floor where there are several other classes. So zoning is important. And another key, the people actually running the building getting cold feet. They don't like the fact that they have to say to people, get on with it. That's life in an era of climate change. But some of the reasons for this are that, of course, you move in and you promote a green building very strongly, and so you get this rebound effect. People who are otherwise very green in their own homes, they recycle, they switch lights off, think they're operating now in a really ultra-efficient building. So it's okay. It doesn't matter that you you leave the lights on. It doesn't matter because we've got solar PVs. It doesn't matter if I leave the hot tap running. We've got solar hot water. So you get this rebound. And I would suggest that some of what happens is the result of that, yet to be confirmed by my own work. So finally, the underlying tensions in trying to design, build, live and work in a green building, the tension between a ready building, something that is going to operate early on and meet people's aspirations and expectations, against the fact that the reality is we're designing prototypes every time we design a new build and open a new building like this. They're all different. They're all in a different place, they're all in a different space, they all have different people in them. And so how do you resolve that tension? The desire of the engineers to automate everything, the desire of the occupants to have some control. The desire between the shock of the new and let's not really think about it. But if we don't do it now, when? Thank you. It's 10:30. I'm sure people want a break. But,
any questions?
If there are any, I'm quite happy to take them, but I'll be around.
Hey, Nigel.
Thank you
very much. On behalf of the AUE, I'd like to thank you for your presentation.
Oh, wonderful.
Please accept this.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.